The health pandemic is the perfect analogy of everything that's wrong in this world and is broken in this world, because it's a curtain raiser for the climate crisis.
I think when we humanize corporations, we're doing something really dangerous, because a corporation, if it were a human, would act like a psychopath.
Today, we're here to tear down this world and build a new one, a world which is fair and just.
My name is Asad Rehman. I'm a climate and economic justice activist.
The fast fashion industry, as we know it, is colonization under a new name. I'm Aja Barber. I'm a writer, sustainability consultant, and slow fashion stylist.
I'm impressed by Aja's uncompromising stance towards fast fashion. She speaks out about the double standards of some of the major brands who claim sustainability whilst exploiting their workers and polluting the environment.
Asad gives voice to communities in the Global South who are disproportionately suffering the impacts of our climate crisis. We both believe it's all related to a flawed economic model, which sacrifices people over profit.
Our methods might be different, but we share the same end goal.
We want to build inclusive movements to halt the devastation of our planet.
Before it's too late. Aja, we're in a fascinating moment, aren't we? We're a moment of multiple crises. We've got the climate crisis, we've got crisis inequality, we've got crisis of material use.
We've
got COVID, the global recession. And I think if you just only look at this moment as this moment without understanding, like from a system change perspective, you know, how did we get here? What are the problems? And then also, how do we get out? You don't really understand. The system is working perfectly for what it was constructed, which is, of course, the extraction and exploitation of both natural resources from people and labour for profit accumulation. I mean, I go back and I would say, you know, if you look right through to slavery and colonialism, you've seen the same pattern, this idea that it is possible to sacrifice large parts of the world, usually people of colour, in the interest of a few people.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the way it's always been. And then, of course, we tie these systems. We don't think that we're in a colonialist system, but if you're actually, like, looking at someone in the Global South and going, that's a good wage for people in that country, but you're not asking, why is that a good wage? Why do we expect that people that live in that country wouldn't want to be making the same, like, nice minimum wage that we're making? The countries that I have lived in, the UK and the US, we are not exporting goods like countries that we need to take goods from. We aren't. And so you can throw a rock and find a country in Africa that is full of resources. And why is there this narrative that, like, oh, Africans are, you know, they need our help. It's so poor there. Why is that?
You know, sometimes I'm often told, oh, stop talking about slavery or colonialism. Those are things in the past. And you say, look, every brick and mortar in this country, every bank, every public building, every canal has been built by the extraction of those profits, whether it's from slavery, using that profit to invest in the British economy, or Britain, of course, during its colonial empire. You know, I'm originally from Pakistan, and just from the Indian subcontinent, when Britain went to India, India's share of global GDP was about 25%. When it left, it was 4%. They'd taken out $45 trillion from India alone. But not only did they do that, they deindustrialized so much part of the Global South, right?
People always say to me, well, you know, if these systems don't exist, what are people in those countries going to do? And I'm like, these are resource-rich countries. If we had a fair system, you wouldn't be asking that. Yeah. If we could unpick all of this, and it's not going to be an overnight thing, obviously. Something's built in 500 years. But if we start to really investigate that, you'll see that this notion that the global north is really helping everyone with these systems is wrong.
Exactly. Now people use this word racialised capitalism, which I think actually does sum up, because it's not just about that capital accumulation, but embedded within it is a very racial notion of, you know, who has the right to dignity and who doesn't, who is a disposable person, who isn't. And that has really prefigured everything. And I think not just from the past, but to this very moment. And that's why we live in a world where it's incredible, right, that we have half of the world still survives on less than the equivalent of $5 a day. You know, the story of the world is that the global south developed the global north and continues to do that. It's not just about a historic thing. I mean, the story is a story of injustice, isn't it?
In my book, I don't say developing countries. I say traditionally pillaged countries because I think that's more accurate. I think that the idea that a country is being developed by us when honestly the resources have been bled dry is just, it's false. We need to talk honestly about these systems if we're ever going to change them.
Agreed. Neoliberalism is the dominant economic ideology of this moment of forced privatisation or corporate power, deregulation and exploitation or weakening of labour rights at a global level. Do you think it's a question of neoliberalism or it's a much bigger question of capitalism as a whole? I
think the problem is people have this notion that if you do not have capitalism, then it's communism. And it's like, I think that it's right to criticize all of these systems, basically.
Yeah. The alternatives are going to be very, very different in many different parts of the world.
Yeah.
But they cannot be based on this same logic, right?
No.
Of extractivism, of constant growth on a finite planet, which doesn't meet the well-being of people, right?
No.
They're not in the interest of social goods. They're actually about profit for a small minority of people.
And that's the problem with greenwashing, what you just said about infinite growth on a finite planet. One of the things that makes me absolutely furious is seeing brands who have wholeheartedly been the reason why these problems exist, then try and participate in the conversations in a really dishonest way. And for people that don't know, greenwashing is basically talking about your business in a very positive way, when in actuality, you might be responsible for environmental destruction. A corporation can only work in its own best interest, which means that if destroying the planet stands in the way of a profit margin, then let's massage the truth about what we're doing, you know? But that doesn't mean we stop destroying the planet, because otherwise we don't make a profit. So I think people need to really keep that in mind. And one of the dangerous things with social media is that corporations really humanize themselves on social media. You know, they get in on the inside jokes on Twitter. They use we like they're not thousands of people, and instead they're just one person who made a boo-boo. And I think when we humanize corporations, we're doing something really dangerous, because a corporation, if it were a human, would act like a psychopath.
Absolutely, and they are, in that sense, psychopaths. Even the idea that corporations have the same legal rights as a human being.
And they do in a court of law.
Not only do they have the same rights, but they actually have enhanced rights. I mean, one of the most pernicious things that I see in the fight, particularly around the climate crisis and inequality, is these investor-state dispute settlement courts, which allow corporations to sue governments if governments make any policy or enact any laws that threaten their profit. So if for tomorrow, for example, Egypt wanted to bring in a minimum wage, and corporations sued the Egyptian government, saying you can't bring in a minimum wage because it will affect our profits. You had Canada, which said, you know, we want to put a moratorium on fracking, you know, exploitation of shale gas, saying it's a climate bomb. And you had the corporations sue the Canadian government. And it's just absolutely incredible how we've constructed a system that benefits basically corporations.
This is exactly why I educate people about fast fashion, because we've reached this point in our society where people say, well, I think the government should just regulate it. Okay, but we aren't going to get there without citizen interest. And we need citizen pressure, because what you just said about corporations suing governments, you know, when you have a corporation that's more powerful than the country in the global south that they are taking advantage of, we have to get involved. And until it becomes something that our lawmakers can't overlook, then nothing will change.
It's a universal truth, isn't it, that all social progress that's ever happened through the history of humanity has come when people collectively organised and expressed their power and made some changes. And when you think about the climate crisis as a microcosm of all that's gone wrong in the world, you know, from the 1970s, we've known that burning fossil fuels, emitting greenhouse gas emissions, results in global warming and has catastrophic impacts. And you don't need to be a climate scientist now, right? You can see killer floods, droughts, famines everywhere in the world. All of this is happening at just 1 degree warming. Scientists tell us don't breach the 1.5 degree warming because that will lead into tipping points. We're heading towards 3 degrees at the moment. Why? Because we've still got an economic system that is based on, you know, the extraction and exploitation of resources, not just of fossil fuels, but of course of food, of land, of commodities and
of labour.
Of labour, exactly. And we, as War on Want, did a study which showed if you took a picture of colonial Africa, of the commodities that were going from colonial Africa to the West, and then you overlaid that now with the companies that control those natural resources. Overwhelmingly here in Europe, we have 100 companies here just in London alone that control $1 trillion worth of mineral wealth of Africa. You see exactly the same picture, that nothing has changed. Those commodity supply chains still flow. The question is, how do we go beyond changing our wardrobe or changing our individual behaviour to be able to change the system?
I think you have to change your individual behavior before you're interested in changing the system. I really do. As someone who was once really deeply into fast fashion, I truly believe that if you're continuing the same cycles, which didn't make me very happy, I'm much happier now, I think that you have to really take yourself out of it. But to define fast fashion is it's clothing that is rapidly produced, often with little care for the workers. And what we've seen is the cycles in which we buy have sped up dramatically. In the last 20 years, it used to be that you had 2 selling seasons, and then it just became more and more and more, and they started doing more fashion shows. And then it became, well, this brand on the high street can get a dress from the runway in the store in 7 days flat, and everyone's going, that's marvelous. And then it's happening consistently. And the only way that you can really churn a profit when you're in the business of selling that amount of clothing is to sell it very quickly and to push it on the consumers. And one of the things that we constantly see in this conversation is brands saying that they're just responding to consumer demand, but that is manufactured demand. Because when I was a teenager, we didn't buy clothing like that.
Sure, and look, and I'm a believer that, of course, we all individually have to take responsibility. But often I think the onus is put on individuals, right? Why don't you just buy less, right? Change your light bulb, don't use straws, etc. Where there, of course, is a bigger structural reason as to why those injustices operate in the first place.
100 corporations are responsible for 71% of carbon emissions. So
Sure.
that is something I always lead with. But I do think that we've become such consumers that we don't question these systems at all. And I think whether we are questioning fast fashion, which, you know, some people love to scream, that's classist, but at the same time, we should also be questioning, why are we lining up for phones? That's a way of creating this demand where you've got planned obsolescence built into a product, and then before you know it, you've got to have the newest and latest phone. Otherwise, you're a loser, and also all of your technology won't work with this phone anymore. I think if we don't pick that apart, we can never really tear down the system.
Sure, and it's absolutely, and of course, you know, we've got to be an ethical consumer. We also need to be a political consumer,
Yes.
right? I mean, we saw during COVID, right? Supply chains shut down their demands for the garment industry. Factory gates shut in Bangladesh and India, Sri Lanka. Garment workers were basically left destitute, no social protection at all, etc. And of course, big brands not paying their bills. But to me, there's a much deeper structural issue, right? Because sometimes people say, well, the answer is I will consume less, right? Which absolutely we need to. But we can't forget, you know, that there is still workers in all of that supply chain, right?
Yeah.
So our demand has got to be, of course, we have to reduce our consumption here, but we also need economic justice for the workers. And I think this is where we need to turn the conversation on its head. And I think we need to be saying, what guarantees everybody the right to a dignified life?
Yeah.
Everybody should have access to health, education, housing. We should have a living wage. Yes, but we also should have the right to energy and food. And that's why I find it quite fascinating that in this moment of when we recognise that all of these issues are global, a lot of people are still thinking about solutions that are either individual or within the nation state, largely basically saying, actually, we will change, we'll protect our economy, we'll protect our citizens, but we're going to continue to sacrifice the global south.
There's so many structural inequalities where if we actually were to divide wealth in a more fair way, I think that we could really change systems. And one thing we know is that 80% of garment workers are women.
Absolutely.
We're getting carried away, so I guess we're going to take some questions.
Hello everyone, my name is Yusuf Baloch. I'm from Balochistan. People are being pushed towards poverty and people are being displaced because of the climate crisis. And what should be the role of the global north countries just to mitigate the crisis?
I think, Yusuf, you're spot on. I mean, the responsibility, as we know, is overwhelming in the global north. The injustice of climate change is that those people who are the least responsible are the ones being most impacted. And so the first things that rich countries can do is follow the science and make sure that they cut their emissions. And so for the poorest people, for the most vulnerable people, people on the front line, they're living actually in a permanent crisis. And the global north is still banking on, you know, some kind of miracle answer for itself, but calculating that large parts of the global south will just become inhospitable, that we will lose millions of people, that millions of people will be displaced from their homes, that people will be plunged into even more forms of extreme poverty. As I said, I'm from Pakistan. We've had in Pakistan temperatures of 53.5 degrees centigrade. That's higher than Death Valley. And the reason why it's called Death Valley is because human beings die. And yet Pakistan is a country where 4 out of 10 people are in multi-dimensional poverty, where one shove pushes people from barely surviving into not surviving. Thank you, Yusuf. Shall we take another question?
Sure.
We know that in the global south, women and girls are really the most affected. So what companies could do to tackle these problems together, this planetary health and the planetary emergency, and at the same time, how can they improve gender equality? Thank you.
You know, I think the gender equality question is the million-dollar question, because whether we're talking about inequality in the global north, which still exists, or inequality in the global south, you know, battling gender inequality is good for all of us. With climate change, it's a threat multiplier, obviously, and women will be more affected because of that.
The just transition has to be an anti-racist transition. It has to be a feminist transition. But it also has to recognise, of course, that, you know, what the policies that are being put forward in the health pandemic is the perfect analogy of everything that's wrong in this world and is broken in this world, because it's a curtain raiser for the climate crisis. You have something that's global. We're told nobody is safe until everybody is safe. And yet, what did we see? We saw rich countries compete with poorer countries for vital health equipment. We saw poorer countries who had their health systems destroyed, largely through our unjust trade rules and our forced privatizations of their health systems. And now, when we have a vaccine, 13% of the world's population in the richest countries have amassed over 50% of all the vaccines, and the poorest countries are not going to get vaccines until 2023 or 2024. And the big pharmaceutical companies are already charging the global south more money for the vaccines than they charge in the global north. And if at this moment we can't have a people's vaccine, what does it say about how we're going to respond to the climate crisis? And particularly for women and young girls who are at the forefront. It's, as you said, it's a threat multiplier. It's all the injustices multiplied.
And to bring it back to, you know, what I do, during all of this, we saw people applauding, you know, fast fashion companies for making masks or for making PPE, while never actually inquiring about whether that was a safe environment for the garment workers who happen to be women. I saw people, you know, in my field being like, oh, well, at least they're doing something good. And I'm like, but are they if they're not protecting their workers? And so we really have to realize that these issues aren't in a silo, but they will be multiplied by climate emergency. But it's already negatively impacting us.
Let's take another question.
Hi. We talk a lot about universal basic services needed if we're going to have a degrowth economy. But it seems that a lot of that depends also on having a healthy democracy to start with. And then it kind of seems quite overwhelming. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, the need for better, healthier democracies.
Absolutely. Of course we need healthier democracies. I mean, if you look at what are now called the anti-imperialist movements, they were all saying we want to limit the control of that Western multinationals have over our resources. We want to redirect everything towards meeting our citizens' well-being. And of course, most of them were violently overthrown because they threatened economic power. Some like Allende in Chile and Mossadegh in Iran and Lumumba in Congo, all of them violently overthrown. And then we have imposed these economic systems through unfair trade rules, corporate power, etc., which take away our rights to be able to even have a vision, even imagine that there be something different. And there's an amazing quote that somebody said, which is, we can more imagine the end of the world than we can imagine the end of capitalism. And that idea that something that we've constructed as human beings we can't change says something about the lack of democracy. It's not simply the act of voting. For me, democracy is about having enough control over our systems to be able to pose alternatives and to see those alternatives come to fruition. Now, there are massive demands. We saw that in 2019, before the COVID pandemic hit. If we remember what that year was massive protests in Chile saying this is not about 30 cents, this is about 30 years of neoliberalism. We saw protests in Sudan, in Algeria, in Lebanon, all around the world where people were saying this system is not working for us. We want something different.
To make it really simplistic, I think everyday people should be really questioning billionaires. I do. I think the notion of a billionaire in a society where we have such staggering wealth inequality, that's not a healthy democracy when people can really bend the laws in their favor. I mean, I write about the Koch brothers in my book. Like, nothing like a group of people that can go into a city like Nashville and overthrow the idea that people should want public transportation because it doesn't work against their best interests. But that did actually happen. It's like, oh, we're investing in fossil fuels, so let's lobby so that there's no public transportation there anymore. So I really think people need to question what people are doing with their money and how it's involved in elections. Currently, we see that Amazon is becoming a real superpower of a company. We need to really start to look at how to regulate their owner because he's going to be one of the biggest employers in America. He currently is.
Thank you for your question.
My name's Sophie. I'm joining from Scotland. And my question is around language. Terms like sustainable are being used so often that they've become a bit diluted. Do you think there's a case for evolving our language, or is there a term that you guys have found in your own work that seems to be more specific and more useful?
I think there's always a case for evolving our language. And yes, I do think that sustainability has wholeheartedly been co-opted by people that are using it for nefarious purposes.
I remember a time, even 10 years ago in the climate movement, where if you said the word climate justice, you were a minority, right? You spoke and situated yourself with the perspectives of the global south and those most impacted. Now you see brands use the word climate justice. You see governments use the word. And of course, they've just captured the word. Doesn't mean that they've actually enacted any policy that addresses the injustice of climate change. And I think we need to be thinking and saying, what's more important is I don't want more fights about new language. I want to take our language and own it and build power and build movements that put real concrete demands into those so that it's impossible for these brands to say, I'm sustainable. I want that sustainability to be, are you doing your fair share on the climate crisis? Are you limiting your material use? Are you tackling inequality? Are you repairing the historical injustice and exploitation? If you are, that's sustainable. If you're not, then you're part of the problem.
One of the big problems is that they managed to separate human rights and sustainability. It was like, well, we care about the planet, we just don't care about the workers.
Exactly.
But it is a sustainable garment, and you can't separate that. They're intrinsically linked.
It's the people who talk about, the organic avocado and ignore the fact that actually...
Who picked that avocado?
Yeah, exactly. And the same industrial agribusiness that was exploiting, industrial meat production is now also doing industrial vegan, vegetarianism, the same exploitation of resources of farmers, and it's repackaged and we're told, well, it's organic, it's okay. Human beings are taken out of the story. That's why I think in all of these stories that we need to tell, we need to resituate people, and we need to resituate the word justice, and we need to rebuild the idea of internationalism and of solidarity between people, because that, I think, is the only answer we have to be able to deal with these crises.
Thank you.
If we can't describe the world we want, how do we expect people to go along with us?
Fast fashion should be actually regulated just like cigarettes. I think that they should have to have a picture on their price tag that shows a factory collapse.
People used to come back to me and say, we're all in it together. Climate change is a universal issue.
Whenever someone says we're all in it together, you know we're not all in it together.